The Netherlands is a nation in Western Europe, snugly in between Belgium and Germany. The nation is in the flat European lowlands, and its name indeed means lowlands, literally Netherlands, or Nederlands in Dutch. Today it's a rich and prosperous nation, with a GDP of about 900 billion and a population of 17 million. To give some comparison with another European nation, France, one of the strongest, biggest, and richest nations in Europe, the Netherlands has nearly a fourth of the population and about a third of the GDP of France, even though France is 13 times bigger than they are and, at least on paper, is in a much better geographical position. However, this nation absolutely did not need to exist. If a few great events had gone differently, or even outright not happened, the idea of a Dutch identity wouldn't even exist, and for sure the nation of the Netherlands would not be in our maps today. So, this begs the question, what if this nation, who has historically pulled way above its weight for how small it is, never existed? What would the effects on our world be? Keep watching to find out. First of all, we need to make this nation not exist in the first place. How can we do that? Well, up till the 1300s, the idea of a united Dutch identity didn't really exist. What is now the Low Countries, aka mainly the Netherlands and Belgium, was nothing more than a heap of small duchies who held no sense of shared being with one another. As with pretty much all of medieval Europe, folk didn't have strong loyalties to national governments, and local authority was mostly in the hands of, well, local authorities. Landlords and aristocrats were the order of the day, and they were sometimes held together by some far off king who didn't really give a fuck as long as he got to stay in power and his subjects paid their taxes and didn't try to rebel. The Dutch were one of, if not the first group in Western Europe to truly grow a sense of shared national kinship, based around their nation rather than some local landlord or duke, even if that sense of shared identity wasn't as strong or widespread as it is nowadays, for a long time. So, how can we snuff out the shaping of this national identity? The idea of a Low Countries identity was first sparked in the Franco-Flemish War of 1297 to 1305. The county of Flanders had been formally part of France since 843 with the Treaty of Verdun, but was largely independent, even if not officially. However, this calm balance was broken by King Philip IV of France. Philip IV, who took power in 1285, made it his goal to strengthen the French monarchy at any cost. And in 1228, only 3 years after taking power, Philip IV tightened his control over Flanders, using complaints over taxes as his reasoning. Guy, the Count of Flanders, wasn't very happy about this and turned to the English under King Edward I for help. A marriage between his daughter and Edward, the Prince of Wales, was arranged. Philip, though, wasn't okay with this and imprisoned Guy alongside his sons and made him call off the marriage. Philip then tried to force Guy to give up his land, holding them under his control, leading Guy to make an alliance with England in 1297. Philip in turn declared the annexation of Flanders and sent an army to secure holding over the country. This ended up failing. Though the French succeeded at first, the Flemish successfully rebelled and defeated the French at the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302. In 1305, the Treaty of Atty-sur-Orge was signed, giving Flanders full independence at the cost of giving up the cities of Lille, Douai, and Orchier. This united struggle against the French forged a sense of shared identity among the folk of Flanders, which later began spreading throughout the rest of the Low Countries. So to kill off a united Dutch identity, we will say that this war never happens. Maybe a more passive French king is in power, or something like that. One way or another, this war never happens. The Low Countries spent much of the 1400s and 1500s under the rule of one big group, whether it be the Burgundians, Habsburgs, and later on the Spanish. This meant that the Low Countries were kind of united, in a way, as a loose region within the Holy Roman Empire. In this alternate world, that never happens. The counties and dukedoms of the Low Countries stay as small little things within the Holy Roman Empire, without there being any form of greater unity or separation at all. And without the Spanish ever ruling the Low Countries, it also means that the folk of the area would have no reason to revolt against the Spanish, since the Spanish wouldn't even be there in the first place. The first thing of importance is how this would affect the Hundred Years' War. In our world, Burgundy allied with the English in 1419, thus lengthening the war by giving the French another foe to fight against. To be fair, I don't see how the outcome of the war would change a lot without Burgundy inheriting the county of Flanders. I'll say they still get Artois, since that by itself wouldn't mean much, but no more than that. With the Duke of Burgundy still wanting power and to take upper hand from the French being weakened, they'd still join the war. Overall, the war still ends the same, with the English driven out and France retaking all lands besides Calais. England is still torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, and the Tudors still take the throne. Some may say that the butterfly effect of an earlier war ending would give rise to another dynasty, or even no War of the Roses at all. And that may be true, but it's impossible to foretell what would happen in such an event, so I'll go ahead and say that the war still drags on long enough for things to go the same as our world. This doesn't seem too far-fetched, as England was still in a good spot by the late 1410s, and I think could have still tugged the war on for another 20 to 25 years, even if it would mean another landing would be needed at some time. Without Burgundy politicking their way through the Benelux, they'd be in a weaker spot than our world. France still annexes the heartland of Burgundy and Franche-Comté, like in our world. It would likeliest happen earlier with a weaker Burgundy. However, a true turning point here is that the Duchess Mary, who came to the throne of Burgundy after the death of the last duke, Charles the Bold, never marries Archduke Maximilian of Austria. Thus the Habsburgs are never able to get a grip on Burgundy, and therefore neither on the Benelux. With the Habsburgs never coming into the picture, France would have annexed this land that they already had tight hold and influence over, with nobody truly being there to stop them. The whole no Dutch state would be wonderful for France. Without a strong nation in the lowlands to balance out the French, and without a unified Habsburg southern lowlands to block them, France would have a far stronger hand, with only the edges of the Holy Roman Empire in their way. Spain would try to stop them, and they'd be somewhat less weakened without needing to fight the Dutch, but they'd still be fighting a shitload of other wars, and they tried and failed to stop French might from growing in Western German lands in our timeline, meaning they'd almost for sure stand no odds of stopping a far better off France. Add on them owning Flanders, Artois, what have you, and France would most likely be able to dominate the lowlands in Western HRE. They'd most likely annex lands up to the Rhine, maybe after the end of the 30 Years' War, or some other war that didn't happen in our world. What we know as the Netherlands, alongside the German lands near the Rhine, would likeliest become French protectorates, with the Habsburgs backed into the wall against France. One of the biggest outcomes of the Netherlands never existing would be no Dutch East India Company. In our world, the Dutch East India Company, or Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, that's a mouthful in Dutch, VOC for short, effectively had full control over trade in the Indian Ocean for over 50 years. In the early and mid-1600s, functioning effectively as its own country and using brute force and might to impose its will upon others, the company was the best of the best among European East Ocean traders. And it shows in their success. By 1648, the Netherlands was the most financially well-off nation in Europe. At its height, this company was worth $7.9 trillion in today's money. The richest companies in the world today can barely even scratch $2 trillion. This makes the Dutch East India Company the wealthiest company to have ever existed in history. Without the VOC, the other eastern colonial powers like England and Portugal would have been better off in the Indian Ocean. Portugal's empire would still have fared badly, since Portugal's low population would give it an underhand against nations like Britain and France, but they'd still do better than in our world. Without the Dutch wrecking their efforts in the East Indies, most of what's now Indonesia would be taken by the Portuguese, with Spain taking some lands in the north in order to not fully miss out on the East Indies cake. Likely shares of New Guinea would fall under the Spanish, with them wanting to use it as a power projection base. As for India, the Dutch never tossing the Portuguese out of much of India would be helpful for them for sure. However, I don't think the Portuguese would keep any stronghold in India. Portugal still kept a fair lot of trade ports even after what the Dutch did in our world, and that didn't let them push into the mainland. And the aforesaid population woes would still get in the way. Britain still becomes the main naval might of the world and still colonizes India in this world. However, with Britain and Portugal always having been allies, and having literally not fought any war since at least the Middle Ages, Britain wouldn't take anything from Portugal by force, with Portugal instead being allowed to keep their colonies, and also giving Britain passage through the Straits of Malacca. I could easily see Britain working through Portugal for power projection in very far-off Asian or Oceanian lands like China, Australia, or the Pacific Islands like Hawaii. Hell, Portugal might even try to project power into those areas themselves, though that seems like a bit of a stretch, and they wouldn't want to piss off Britain, so I'll leave things at that. Without Dutch economics being ahead of its time, to use as an example by other nations, such as setting up stock markets, having pretty advanced production, what have you, economics and capitalism might take a bit longer to evolve to the level that they did in our world. That's not to say it wouldn't. Europe was already a highly mercantist society, and nations like England were already moving towards capitalism, but it might be pushed back somewhat. Then again, I'm not sure how much Dutch practices influenced Europe in later years, so I'll say that the timing of things like industrialization and technological innovation is mostly the same. France having a stronger hand would make them far scarier to the rest of Europe. With a border up to the Rhine and the lowlands and shares of the Western HRE in their grip, France and Austria would be even more bitter foes than in our world. As in our world, there'd be great wars against France, with heaps of Europe teaming up to stop the nation from getting too strong. However, France would fare far better in these wars in the late 1600s and early 1700s in this world, instead of being driven into stalemate. First of all, without the Spanish in the lowlands, they'd hardly if at all be a factor, and know that Netherlands means, obviously, another off-holding block gone. France would also have more manpower to draw upon, with more land and a greater sphere of influence, and Britain wouldn't be able to use the lowlands as a somewhat narrow stinter to the French, instead being made to land in and shield the wide plains of northern Germany. we'd most likely see France decisively win wars such as the Nine Years' War and the War of the Spanish Succession, or alternate wars that would end up with the same outcome. Spain would be sucked firmly into France's sphere of influence, and Austria would be deeply weakened, with almost all of the HRE falling into French hands. Britain, being stronger on sea and being highly wealthy, would do its best to fight the French on the waves and with silver and gold. I could easily see them trying to bribe nations like Russia or the Ottomans into standing against the French, or Spain for that matter. With Austria so deeply weakened, you might think that the Ottomans could come back for a third time and take Vienna, but I doubt it, since Poland, Lithuania, and Russia are still there, and I don't think France would want the Ottomans being right next to the heart of Germany. There would be another war. We'll say that Prussia still strikes Austria in 1740, and France, wanting to stop any other German state from becoming too mighty, helps out the Austrians. The Russians would likely hop in on the side of the Prussians, worried that if France won this war, they'd be able to threaten and spread influence in Eastern Europe, and as a whole to stop them from getting even stronger. Britain, of course, would also hop in alongside maybe Portugal and one or both of the Scandinavian nations. France, walding over most of Europe and very rich, would be able to wield great strength in this war. However, the naval strength and wealth of Britain, sheer military efficiency and genius of Prussia, and the great numbers of the Russians, with Austria likely being knocked out during the war by a Russo-Prussian effort, would mean that France wouldn't be able to fully crush their foe. In the end, the war would likely end in a stalemate, with Prussia getting Silesia, but everything else going back to how it was before the war. France would still lose the North American colonies, albeit without a 7 Years' War as we knew it, it would likely take longer. Britain would still be stronger at sea, making it easier to cut off the colonies in wartime, and them having such an overwhelming population in North America when likened to the French would mean that the French hold over North America would be unupkeepable. The Brits would slowly move into the French colonies and overtake whatever small French settlings were there. Also, the French would need to oversee a great swath of Europe, while Britain would be an island empire, so Britain could focus more on the colonies than France could. France had a far tighter policy on who they allowed to go to the colonies, so unless they changed that, their colonies would be fucked from low population. There would be no French Revolution. The French kings would be seen as successful heroes, wielding over an empire that held Western and Central Europe starkly under its heel. This also means no rise of Napoleon, which would have effects such as delaying the spread of Enlightenment ideals, no Napoleonic legal code, and the Spanish Empire living on for longer without a peninsular war. Likely until this timeline's a likening of World War I, if such a war happened in this world. Russia would take far more of the Ottoman Balkans without Austria there to balance it out, with most of the area falling into Russia's sphere later in the 1800s. Other European nations may speak out about this, which could lead to an alternate Crimean War type thing, maybe even a few of them. Hungary would likely be free, but they'd realistically ally with Russia, so Russia wouldn't be competing with them, but rather working with them. France's empire would fall, most likely slowly falling apart from the late 1700s to the mid 1800s or so. France would still keep their borders up to the Rhine, since those lands would have been a part of France for so long by now, and they would see themselves as French. Nationalism would still rise, and Germany and Italy would still unite. Rebellions against the French would give them some sense of unity, and the Germans for sure would realize that they needed to stick together or else something like this, where they're downtrodden by outsiders, could happen again. Italy has such a history of being someone else's bitch that it might be harder there, but I still find it likely that it would happen there too, especially with the ideology rising in Germany and likely as the rest of Europe. Also, Prussia would promote nationalism in Germany, wanting to gain more might for themselves and wanting to stir up a force that could help against the French. Germany would slowly be pulled into a confederation with Prussia at the helm, whether as a Prussian HRE or its own thing, and would full on unite most likely in the 1870s to 1880s, maybe 1890s. Overall, by 1900, you'd have a world and European continent that would look more or less like this. Spain is maybe still barely grasping onto its empire, on the edge of losing it any day, with only France, who'd most likely still be propping them up, stopping it from falling. The Balkans are under a Russo-Hungarian sphere of influence, with the Ottomans still not doing too hot. Africa is mostly the same since the Dutch hardly affected that. I'll end off this timeline now since there's really no way for me to predict any further. I hope you enjoyed this scenario. Feel free to like and subscribe if you did. I'll be doing these kinds of videos fairly often, with this being my first one, so stay tuned. See y'all next time.